What is lo-fi? Where does it come from? Who makes it? If beats are relaxed and chill and no one studies to them, is it still lo-fi? We want to know the truth.
You gotta know the truth, because the truth will set you free.
About lo-fi.
Hi, I'm Will, I'm an audio engineer, and if you clicked on this video, you've probably seen a stream on YouTube called Lo-Fi Hip-Hop Beats to Relax and Study To, or maybe you're a fan of bands like Pavement, Guided by Voices, or the Velvet Underground. One way or the other, this video is going to give you a technical definition for lo-fi, give you some historical context, and provide some philosophy surrounding the concept of lo-fi. So without further ado, let's get into it. Lo-fi is a style of production. A single instrument or an entire song can be lo-fi. It's an abbreviation for low fidelity. Fidelity meaning accuracy in reproducing a sound. But what sound is it? The acoustic sound being recorded? Sounds in high fidelity music are often compressed, auto-tuned, and doubled, and so on. It's better to say that lo-fi's defining characteristic is that it champions technical imperfections that are undesirable in other styles of production. But a lot of records have technical imperfections, and no one's calling them lo-fi. So what makes lo-fi distinct and recognizable? In order to find out, we need to see where the sound came from and how the term has been used throughout history. First, I'd like to talk about how lo-fi is being used today in 2020, because I think it's become the most mainstream in this context. Later in the video, I'll be describing lo-fi's indie and DIY origins. Lo-fi today is most commonly associated with the YouTube livestream Lo-Fi Hip-Hop Radio Beats to Relax/Study To. It's kind of like this generation's easy listening music. It's a unique medium, almost like the nephew of radio. A notable feature is the chat, which endlessly, hypnotically pours in from all parts of the world at all hours. The most common production elements in lo-fi hip-hop are wow and flutter, distortion, limited frequency response, and noise. I'll be speaking more on those later in the video. Alongside these characteristic lo-fi sounds, it's common to hear hi-fi sounds as well, as long as one or two lo-fi elements are being featured at a time. Next, I've created a sample of lo-fi hip-hop so that I can break it down and show you what each of the individual elements are contributing to the song. Alright, so I made this really quickly. I think it sounds like pretty typical lo-fi hip-hop. I'm going to break it down to show you what makes it lo-fi. What makes something lo-fi has more to do with the timbre of the instrument than it does with the notes and rhythms being played. If you want to learn more about timbre, check out my last video. Alright, let's start with the beat. These drums have kind of a vintage sound to them because they're bandpassed and a little bit saturated. Being bandpassed just means there's an absence of high and low frequencies, kind of like this. Saturation is just a subtle form of distortion. Here, I'll emphasize the effect. Next up is noise. Noise is a big part of lo-fi. It's something you really want to avoid in other styles of production, but it's everywhere in low fidelity music. Tape hiss and vinyl crackle are some of the most common sources of noise in lo-fi music, but wind, rain, and other sounds from nature are common substitutes. Next, let's add the piano sample. This sample has been chopped up and rearranged, which has more to do with hip-hop than it does lo-fi, but you'll notice the piano is also being bandpassed and saturated like the drums. It also has a bit of noise. There's one other thing that makes this piano lo-fi, which is wow and flutter. Here, I'll emphasize the effect. Wow and flutter is basically just random fluctuations in pitch due to variations in playback speed. Alright, now let's take a minute just to listen to everything together.
You solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give in this cause to be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Sampling is a big part of hip-hop tradition, but they're often chosen for their lo-fi qualities in this context. Field recordings, voicemail, and movie dialogue are all prime candidates for being sampled. I'll point out that the samples are chosen because they exhibit desirable lo-fi traits but aren't really themselves lo-fi. The fact that the timbre is referencing something from the past is a key part of how we use lo-fi today. And I think it's one of the things that makes this one of the most interesting topics of music, because lo-fi is kind of universal in this way. All recorded music listening cultures work their way up from distorted, wow and fluttering, noisy audio together. And yes, there are exceptions to this universality argument, but I think this can account for some of the cross-cultural appeal that we can witness when watching the YouTube chat of lo-fi hip-hop radio. Also, the lo-fi effect will be preserved to some degree through classic media like older Disney films, period pieces, and modern media making direct references to older formats. The aesthetic goals of lo-fi range from nostalgic to somber to simply relaxed or low energy in some other way. At times when I've needed to chill or study, I found a sense of comfort in the fact that there were tens of thousands of other people there for the exact same thing, feeling the same thing together, lo-fi. So this is my Tascam Porta Studio. So before DAWs and consumer audio interfaces existed, home recordists could use magnetic tape to capture their music. It records on a cassette, which is a small, convenient analog tape format. There were also wider formats of tape, but they came at a cost. Cassette recorders like the Porta Studio created a revolution that made recording for everybody. Cassette multitracks were affordable, convenient, and have built-in mixing features. So, this unit can record 2 tracks simultaneously and store up to 4 separate tracks of audio. I'm going to get technical here for just a minute. I did some measurements of the Porta Studio. I wanted to give some real-world examples of where some of the effects that we use in lo-fi today are coming from. I want to note that these are not great conditions for the Porta Studio. I'm not using the right power supply for it. I'm using 9 volts instead of 12, and these are also pretty much the cheapest cassettes I could buy. I think I got 100 of them for like $20. So this is the frequency response of the Porta Studio, just going straight in and straight out of the machine. If you haven't read a graph like this before, it's basically just lower to the left, higher to the right, louder is up, quieter is down. The response looks reasonably linear to me. It goes all the way from below 30 hertz up to 20 kilohertz, so that's pretty much the range of human hearing. Let's see what happens after we do the same thing, but we record to tape. And this is the response of the Porta Studio after going to tape. You can see in the red there that the response is getting much more erratic, and that it also starts to fall off around 6 or 7K. So when I was talking earlier about limited frequency response and band passing being indicative of older recording formats, this is real-world proof of that. You can see that the cassette's response has significantly less high end than you would get in a modern system. So this is a 1 kilohertz test tone in and out of the machine. You can see it looks reasonably clean. There's no visible harmonics showing up above the fundamental there at 1K. And this is me pushing the preamps into distortion. You can see there's a mix of even and odd harmonics. This is the 1 kilohertz tone after being recorded to tape. There's a few things going on here. There's the harmonics at 2 kilohertz and 3 kilohertz. I believe that is tape saturation. And then there is some frequencies surrounding the 1 kilohertz tone. I believe this is a result of amplitude modulation. I don't think amplitude modulation is an inherent part of recording to tape. I think it probably has more to do with me using the incorrect power supply, but that's what that is. And to illustrate while in Flutter, I have recorded a 1 kilohertz test tone into Autotune or Melodyne, and you can see it's perfectly flat like you'd expect it to be. And now we are seeing the 1 kilohertz test tone after going to tape. You can see the pitch is rising and falling pretty quickly. And again, in this type of graph, up is sharp, down is flat, and then left and right is just time. But yeah, this is a real-world example of WoW in Flutter. So one notable thing that this unit is missing is the ability to bounce. Other 4-track machines would have the ability to condense multiple signals down into one channel. For example, you could have drums on channels 1 and 2 and bass on 3, and take all 3 of those signals and condense it down to channel number 4. That would leave the previous 3 channels open to be recorded over. So now you could add a guitar on 1, another guitar on 2, and vocals on 3, and then you'd have a mono channel on 4, which has drums and bass on it. It's worth noting, anytime something gets condensed in this way, it's being re-recorded, and as a result, the sound quality degrades further, so you'll get more noise and other imperfections that are inherent with this type of recording. So what separates other types of distortion, limited frequency response, and noise from lo-fi? It's this thing. Does everyone in lo-fi hip-hop have one of these? No, probably not. Most people are probably using a plugin to emulate the sound. Isotope vinyl is a popular choice for its warp depth feature, and it's also free. My personal favorite is Sketch Cassette. It does so many things just right, and I think it's like $20. But in my opinion, the archetypal lo-fi sound as we know it today comes from cassette recorders like this, like the Porta Studio. So now we understand the technical component of lo-fi. But before YouTube was even a thing, and before people were searching out the sound of the Porta Studio, there were bands like Pavement, Guided by Voices, and Beck that people would call lo-fi. Even after setting aside both hip-hop and chill elements, the way that they used lo-fi was totally different. Before the aesthetics of lo-fi were being intentionally sought out, professional artists were starting to happen upon them. When the tape recorders that I mentioned earlier became accessible, these artists would use them to create demos with the intention of re-recording the songs at a later date in a high-end studio, but they didn't always end up liking the results they got at the studio better. For example, Bruce Springsteen discovered the appeal of the homemade demo while recording his album Nebraska, 1982. Even after recording hi-fi versions of the songs at a nice studio, many people noted that they preferred the demos. After much deliberation, Springsteen decided to release the original tape as the master. But hold on, Springsteen wasn't using lo-fi to emphasize a sense of nostalgia. At this point, the tape recorders were still relatively new. Instead, the home-recorded sound emphasizes a sense of intimacy and privacy. It's vulnerable to present yourself without the polish offered by a professional recording studio, in a way. Moving on, in 1986, a DJ named William Berger popularized the term lo-fi with his weekly radio segment dedicated to home recording music. Artists would submit their cassettes, hoping to get their song played on the air, and people scraping together tapes like this deserve a lot of the credit for embracing the sound. Soon after, home-recorded albums made by the likes of Guided by Voices, Pavement, Beck, Daniel Johnston, The Velvet Underground, and so on started to be championed under the title lo-fi. Bands like these weren't really using lo-fi as a way to demonstrate vulnerability, intimacy, or nostalgia. I'm pretty sure they just thought it sounded cool or they didn't really care. But what they showed us is that lo-fi can also be used to give off a slacker, punk, or alternative aesthetic. Also, previously mentioned bands like Pavement, Beck, as well as more modern artists like Mac DeMarco, contrast lo-fi hip-hop in the sense that they aren't putting a focal point on the lo-fi component of their music. It's more that their music sounds different than music that's recorded in high-end studios because it's recorded at home, and so people ended up calling them lo-fi. So why do people often find they like their demo better than the version of their song that they recorded at a nice studio? Well, in my last video, I made a comparison between speakers and venues. We often write music to fill a space and not the other way around. Just like a punk band doesn't sound good in a cathedral, a lo-fi song doesn't sound quite right when it's made hi-fi and vice versa. When you make something hi-fi, there's all this extra room that you need to fill up, and it's pretty easy to muddy the original intentions of a piece while doing so. Now, I'm an audio engineer. I've made some of these records. I love lo-fi as much as anyone, but I want to make it clear, I'm not saying lo-fi is the only way to make a great record. Everything that's great about lo-fi has its foil in hi-fi, and everything that's great about working alone has its foil in collaboration. There's a place in your life for both, and that goes for music listeners, musicians, and engineers. Now that we have studied, we can chill. With all three components of lo-fi combined, technical, historical, and philosophical, we can finally become lo-fi.